The night was restless, the kind of night when the wind carried whispers through the narrow streets and the scent of rain promised more than a passing storm. Clara Holden stepped out of the back door of her little bookstore, the last lamplight from inside spilling across the worn boards beneath her boots before the door shut, and left her in the dim glow of a lone lantern swinging on its hook. She pulled her shawl tighter, the fabric scratching softly against her neck, and breathed in the damp air heavy with coal smoke from a nearby chimney. Her day had been long stacking books, mending spines, tallying accounts until her fingers ached, and all she wanted now was the comfort of her small house at the edge of town. The storm clouds overhead were gathering thick and low, churning like restless cattle, and the shortcut through the alley seemed the wiser path before the skies opened. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and stepped into the narrow passageway. Between the buildings, the boards beneath her feet groaning quietly, each sound strangely loud in the empty night. The air here was cooler, denser, shadows pooling deep where the moonlight couldn't reach. Halfway through, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the rain footsteps. Slow, measured, heavy. They came from ahead, hidden in the thickest dark. She froze, her breath hitching, the hair on the back of her neck prickling. From the blackness ahead, a shape emerged, a tall, broad silhouette, the kind of presence that seemed to swallow the narrow space. Then a glint of metal caught the lantern light. Her stomach turned to ice, a revolver. The man stepped closer, the brim of a weathered hat shadowing his face, the rest of him hidden beneath a rain-darkened coat that clung to a frame built for work or trouble. "Stop right there," he said, his voice low and cold, yet not entirely cruel. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, not just from fear but from a strange familiarity she couldn't place. She obeyed, frozen under the weight of that gun barrel aimed square at her chest. Rain began to patter softly on the rooftops above, running in thin streams down the warped boards of the alley. What do you want?" she asked, trying for steadiness but hearing the tremor in her own voice. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he were stripping away years with his eyes. "Move slow," he finally said, his tone even but edged. "Hands where I can see him." She raised her hand slightly, the shawl slipping from one shoulder, letting in a cold draft that tightened her skin. He stepped forward, each footfall deliberate. Up close, she noticed his coat was soaked, the rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat, sliding down to patter against the revolver. Something about his stance, his voice had tugged at a thread deep in her memory. She tried to place it, but the thought slipped away when he closed the gap between them. Her heel brushed against a loose board, and he caught the movement instantly. "Don't," he warned sharply, the word hanging in the air like a drawn blade. Lightning flared in the distance, just enough to illuminate the side of his face. Her breath caught. There, cutting a thin, pale line from his jaw to his neck, was a scar she had seen before, a scar she'd once traced with the curious fingers of a girl too young to know the weight of what she was doing. The years had sharpened. His features carved hardship into his eyes, but she knew. She knew. And even before her lips formed the sound, his gaze locked onto hers as if he already knew what she was about to say. Clara's heart was pounding so hard it almost drowned out the sound of the rain. Each beat a deep thud against her ribs as the man before her stood unmoving, his revolver still trained on her chest. The alley felt narrower now, as if the shadows themselves were closing in to listen. She opened her mouth, and for a moment no sound came out, only a small breath that escaped like steam in the cold night air. Then, in a voice so soft it almost felt like it belonged to another time, she spoke a single word, his name, Elias. It slipped from her lips with a mixture of disbelief and certainty, trembling like the memory it carried. The effect on him was instant and startling. His shoulders stiffened, not in aggression but in something closer to shock, the revolver in his hand lowering by the smallest fraction. The rain tapped against the brim of his hat, running in rivulets down the line of his jaw, but he didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes shadowed, but piercing shifted, their cold edge faltering into something she hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Clara could almost see the years peeling away in that instant, revealing a boy she once knew, a boy who had been barely more than skin and bone, half conscious in her father's barn, bleeding from a gunshot wound no one else in town would have risked helping. She remembered how she had hidden him under a pile of hay, how she'd brought him bread and water, and how he'd whispered his name to her like a secret he was afraid to lose. Now here he was again, standing in front of her in the rain, his hand trembling just slightly on the revolver. The silence between them was heavy, weighted with years of separation and all the untold stories that had carried him from that boy in the barn to this man in the shadows. Ilias's gaze darted over her face, as if searching for proof that she was real, as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. His lips parted, and for a moment she thought he would speak, but the words seemed trapped somewhere in his throat. "You remember me," she said, more statement than question, her voice breaking just slightly on the last word. His jaw worked, but instead of answering, he exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that carried frustration, disbelief, and something dangerously close to longing. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, he lowered the revolver another inch, though he didn't put it away. "Clara," he murmured, and hearing her name from his mouth after all these years made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. The way he said it was different from the way anyone else ever had. It carried weight, history, and an unspoken gratitude she had never been able to forget. The rain intensified, drumming against the rooftops, sliding in silver streaks down his coat. The smell of wet earth filled the alley. She took a tentative step toward him, and though his grip on the revolver tightened again, he didn't raise it. The air between them was electric, tense not just with danger, but with the ghost of the bond they had once shared. "Why are you here?" she asked softly, her words almost lost under the hiss of the rain. His gaze broke from hers for a moment, drifting toward the street beyond the alley as though weighing whether to run. When his eyes came back to hers, they were harder, guarded again, but that crack, the one she had seen when she whispered his name, was still there, glimmering just beneath the surface. He said nothing, but in the stillness she understood something unspoken. This was no accident. He hadn't just stumbled into her path. And that realization carried a different kind. A fear, one that wasn't about the gun or even the danger he might bring, but about the truth she might uncover if she pushed too hard. The sound of his name still hung between them like a drawn breath, and for a long, aching moment, Elias didn't speak, his eyes locked on hers as though the years between them were nothing more than a thin sheet of glass. Clara had always imagined that if she ever saw him again, he would be the boy she'd known, lean, quick smiling despite his injuries, with that spark in his gaze that seemed to defy the whole world. But the man standing before her was harder now, shaped by the kind of life that ground hope down to dust. His jaw was more angular, his shoulders broader, his presence heavier in a way that couldn't be mistaken for mere strength. It was the weight of survival. She felt the memory of that summer years ago unfurl inside her, the smell of sun-warmed hay in the loft, the rustle of the barn's wooden beams in the wind, the muffled groan of a stranger in pain. She'd been no more than 17, barefoot in the straw, when she found him bleeding, feverish, and clutching a revolver like it was the only thing tethering him to life. He'd told her his name in a whisper so faint she'd had to lean close to hear it, and in that moment, she'd made a decision that would change them both. She hid him from everyone, even her father. For weeks she'd brought him bread stolen from the kitchen and water carried in a tin cup, sitting beside him in the half-light as he recovered. He'd told her little of himself, but enough for her to know he'd been running from something dangerous. And then, one morning he was gone. No note, no trace. Just the faint indent in the straw where he'd been sleeping. Standing here now, with the rain tracing lines down his scarred cheek, she realized she'd never stopped wondering what had happened to him. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "Might have been better if I was," he muttered, the bitterness in his tone sharp enough to cut. That bitterness carried years of unspoken stories, nights on the run, friends turned to enemies, deals gone wrong. He wasn't the boy she'd saved. He was the ghost of him, rebuilt from scraps and scars. "You disappeared," she pressed, needing answers she wasn't sure. She wanted. Elias's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation, as though deciding how much truth to give her. "I had to," he said at last, his voice low, the rain almost drowning it out. "They found me, the men I was running from. If I'd stayed—" He trailed off, but she knew what he meant. If he'd stayed, they would have found her too. That thought hit her like a cold slap. "So you ran," she said, though there was no accusation in it, only understanding. He gave a small, humorless smile. "You think I've stopped running since?" He shook his head, glancing past her down the alley, eyes scanning the shadows like a man who never felt safe in one place too long. She studied him, noting the way his hand still hovered near the revolver, not quite relaxed. This wasn't just a chance meeting. She could feel it in her bones. Something had brought him here tonight. The Elias she remembered had been careful with his words, but the Elias standing before her now seemed weighed down by them, each one a risk. "Why come back?" she asked finally. The question seemed to land heavier than she expected, his gaze hardening before flicking away. When he looked back at her, there was something in his eyes, something unguarded, fleeting. "Because," he said slowly, "I couldn't keep running without seeing you just once." The words hit her harder than the gun ever could have, because she heard the truth in them, buried under all his years of grit and silence. But before she could respond, a distant sound carried through the rain, a faint metallic clatter, followed by the unmistakable echo of boots on wet boards. Elias's entire posture shifted in an instant, every muscle tightening. His eyes darted toward the sound, then back to her, the warmth of recognition replaced with urgency. "We don't have time," he said, his voice sharper now. "They're here." The sound of approaching boots was muffled by the rain, but to Elias it was as loud as a warning bell, every step echoing in the hollow spaces carved by years of running. His eyes swept the mouth of the alley once more before locking back on Clara, urgency tightening every line of his face. "We don't have time," he said again, but this time his voice carried something heavier than fear. It was the weight of a man who'd been here before, who knew exactly how this would end. If they stayed. Clara's brow furrowed, confusion cutting through the unease already twisting in her gut. "Who's here?" "Elias, what's going on?" He stepped closer, the rain plastering his coat to his shoulders, his shadow looming over her in the narrow space. "They're after me," he said bluntly, though his voice dropped lower, as if the very walls might betray them. "And now?" "They're after you." The words landed like a stone in her chest. "Me?" Her disbelief was almost a laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't even know." "You do," he interrupted, his tone sharp, almost desperate. "You think it's a coincidence I found you?" "Your name came up, Clara, in the wrong kind of conversation. Men like them don't say a name unless they've got a reason." His hand flexed against the revolver at his side, not from nerves, but from readiness, like a man who knew violence was already on its way. Clara's heart hammered, but she kept her chin up. "If this is supposed to scare me into running, You're wasting your breath. I'm not leaving my home." He gave a short, humorless laugh that held no joy. "You think this is about scaring. You? This is about keeping you breathing." The rain drummed harder now, streaking down between them in silver threads. She studied his face, seeing the lines carved by years of caution, of choices made with no good options. He wasn't the kind of man who came asking for favors. Elias Kane had been shaped into someone who took what he needed and kept moving. Yet here he was, not taking, but pleading in his own jagged way. "I can take care of myself," she said, though her voice wavered just enough for him to catch it. "Not against them," he countered instantly. "Not against men who shoot first and don't bother with questions." He stepped even closer, his presence pressing in on her until she could see the rain clinging to the tips of his eyelashes. "I need you to trust me, Clara. Leave town tonight. Get as far from here as you can before they—" He stopped short, jaw tightening, the end of the sentence left to the imagination. "Before they what?" she asked, her voice sharper now, demanding the truth. He didn't answer, only looked at her with something that was almost regret. The boots were closer now, 2 sets, maybe 3, picking up speed, the sound bouncing off the wet walls of the alley. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the way his body shifted subtly toward the sound without fully turning his back on her. "I'm not running," she said again, firmer this time. "This is my home, my life. I won't be chased out because of some ghost from my past." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. "Then you're going to need me," he said, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because if you stay, so do I, and that means they'll find us both." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words were drowned out by the sudden metallic scrape of a revolver being cocked from somewhere just beyond the alley's end. Elias's hand went to her arm, not rough, but firm enough to pull her into the deeper shadows against the wall. "No more talking," he whispered. His breath warmed despite the cold rain. "When I say move, you move." The air in the alley had shifted heavier now, tight with the kind of silence that only comes before a gunshot. Elias's grip on Clara's arm was unyielding, his eyes locked toward the mouth of the alley where the faint glint of metal had just betrayed their watchers. The rain was coming down harder, turning the cobblestone slick, sending rivulets racing toward the gutters, but even the pounding of the storm couldn't mask the shuffle of boots drawing closer. Clara's pulse was loud in her ears, but she refused to let him see her fear. Still, she felt the tremor in his hand, not from nerves, but from coiled readiness, like a wolf about to lunge. "Stay behind me," he murmured without looking back, the words more command than request. She opened her mouth to argue, but the moment she did, a figure stepped into view, a tall man in a dark oilskin coat, his hat brim low, his revolver already out and pointed. Behind him, 2 more shapes emerged, shadows made flesh, moving with the confidence of men who'd done this many times before. "Kane," the lead man said, his voice carrying easily over the rain, low and sure. "You've been a hard one to find." Elias didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "Guess you weren't looking hard enough." The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, we've been looking. And then we hear about this little lady here." His eyes shifted to Clara, lingering just long, enough to make her skin crawl. "And we thought, maybe she's the way to draw you out." Elias's stance shifted a fraction barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, but Clara felt it through his hand. The way a horse feels. The tightening of reins. "You lay one finger on her," he said, his voice low and lethal, "and you'll find out just how hard I am to kill." The rain hissed on the barrels of the men's guns, their movements slow but certain as they began to spread, trying to hem him in. Clara's breath caught. The alley felt narrower now, the walls pressing in. The lead man took another step forward, and Elias moved, quick as a rattlesnake. His revolver was in his hand before she even saw it leave the holster, the report of the first shot cracking through the rain like lightning. The lead man staggered, a bloom of red blooming across his coat before he crumpled into the mud. 4. A heartbeat, the world froze. Then chaos erupted. One of the others fired, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the storm, and Elias shoved Clara down hard against the wall as the bullet screamed past where her head had been a second earlier. He fired back, his movements fast but controlled, each shot deliberate, each step angled to keep himself between her and the danger. Clara could feel the vibrations of each gunshot in her bones, smell the acrid bite of powder mixing with the rain. One man went down, clutching his side, his gun clattering to the stones. The last one, a wiry figure with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, ducked behind a barrel, firing blind into the alley. Elias moved like he'd been born. In gunfights, sliding into cover, counting the rhythm of the shots before leaning out to return fire. The man jerked once, twice, before falling forward into the water rushing along the cobblestones, the red spilling from him carried away in thin streams. And then silence, broken only by the drum of rain. Elias stood still for a moment, his chest rising and falling hard, eyes sweeping the alley for any sign of movement. Clara pushed herself up from the wall, her hands shaking despite herself. "Elias," she began, but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes, sharp, watchful, the kind of look a man wears when he knows killing once means more will follow. He holstered his revolver slowly, then stepped to the fallen lead man, crouching to check his pockets. "They weren't here by chance," he said, almost to himself. "They knew exactly where to find us." He pulled something from the dead man's coat, a small scrap of paper, crumpled and soaked, but with a name written on it in ink that hadn't yet bled away. Clara's name. Her breath caught, and suddenly the storm felt colder. "We have to move," Elias said, his tone flat but urgent. "Now." The storm hadn't let up, it was still coming down in relentless sheets, turning the streets into rivers and the night into a shroud. Elias led Clara through the back alleys like a man navigating a maze he'd memorized long ago, his pace fast, but deliberate, his head always turning, scanning for shadows that didn't belong. The gunfight's echoes were long gone, swallowed by the rain, but both of them knew that silence in this town was never safety. It was just the pause before the next trouble found you. Clara kept close behind him, her boots slipping on the slick stones, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She wanted to ask where they were going, but the tightness in his shoulders told her not to. Finally, he ducked into a narrow passage between two leaning buildings, the space barely wide enough for them to pass. When they emerged, they were in a small courtyard lit by the dim orange glow of a single lantern swaying in the wind. Elias stopped, turned to her, and for the first time since the alley, she saw something in his eyes other than calculation, something raw, like a crack in armor that had been there for years. "You've got a choice to make," he said, his voice low but steady. "You can keep running with me until they're all gone. Or you can walk away now, disappear before it gets worse." She stared at him, rain dripping from her hair, her chest still tight from the fight. "And what about you?" His gaze held hers for a long moment before drifting away. "I've been running too long to stop now. But you still got a chance at something better." She stepped closer, anger flaring in her voice. "You think after tonight I can just go back? Pretend none of this happened? You dragged me into your war, Elias." His jaw tightened. "I dragged you out of your own grave." The words hung heavy between them, cutting through the hiss of the rain. She knew he was right, but that didn't make the choice any easier. Somewhere in the distance, faint but distinct, came the sound of hoofbeats on wet stone, steady, unhurried. the kind of approach made by men confident they'd cornered their prey. Elias heard it too. His hand went to his revolver, thumb resting on the hammer. "It's them," he said simply. Clara swallowed, glancing toward the dark street beyond the courtyard. "Then I guess we're not done." He almost smiled at that, a grim, fleeting thing, but then the moment was gone. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the walls until the first rider emerged from the shadows. Then another, and another. 4 in total, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their coats heavy and dark against the rain. The lead rider dismounted slowly, his boots splashing in the pooling water. "Kane," he called, his voice carrying easily. "You've caused us a fair bit of trouble tonight." Elias said nothing, just shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of Clara. "But the way I see it," the man continued, "you've got a chance to walk away from this. Hand over the girl, and maybe we forget we ever saw you." Clara felt Elias's body go still, like the pause before a coiled spring snaps. "Not happening," he said flatly. The man sighed, as if disappointed but not surprised. "Then I guess this is the part where you die." He motioned with his hand, and the riders began to spread out, circling. The courtyard suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't step back. Elias drew his revolver in one smooth motion, the metallic click of the hammer pulling back sounding like a promise. The next moments were a blur of thunder and fire, the crack of gunshots tearing through the rain, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night in harsh bursts. Elias moved with lethal precision, each shot finding its mark, but the riders were fast, firing back as they closed the distance. One fell hard into the mud, another staggered before slumping against a wall. The lead man charged, knife flashing in the lantern light, but Clara moved before she could think, snatching a dropped revolver from the ground and firing once, the shot striking true. The man collapsed, his blade clattering beside him. And then it was over. The rain kept falling, washing the blood into the gutters, leaving only the sound of water and the faint groan of a dying lantern. Elias turned to her, his face unreadable. "Guess you made your choice," he said quietly. Clara looked down at the gun in her hand, then back at him. "Guess I did." For the first time, he let the smallest hint of a smile reach his eyes. But it wasn't victory, just the knowledge that whatever came next, they were in it together. Somewhere far off, another set of hoofbeats began to echo.